of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in which these tales come to their end. Of old, there was Sauron the Maya, whom the Sindar in Beleriand named Gothor the Cruel. In the beginning of Ada, Melkor seduced him to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms, and for long, if he willed, he could still appear noble and beautiful, so as to deceive all but the most wary. When Thangorudrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again and did obeisance to Eonwe, the herald of Manwe, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the West. But it was not within the power of Eonwe to pardon those of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aman and there receive the judgment of Manwe. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation and to receive from the Vala a sentence, it might be, of long servitude, in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore when Eonwe departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. In the great battle and the tumults of the fall of Thangorudrim, there were mighty convulsions in the earth, and Beleriand was broken and laid waste, and northward and westward many lands sank beneath the waters of the great sea. In the east, in Osiriand, the walls of Eredluin were broken, and a great gap was made in them towards the south, and a gulf of the sea flowed in. Into that gulf the river Lune fell by a new course, and it was called therefore the Gulf of Lune. That country had of old been named Lindon by the Noldor, and this name it bore thereafter, and many of the Eldar still dwelt there, lingering, unwilling yet to forsake Beleriand, where they had fought and labored long. Gil-galad, son of Fingon, was their king, and with him was Elrond, half-elven, son of Earendil the Mariner, and brother of Elros, first king of Númenor. Upon the shores of the Gulf of Lune, the elves built their havens and named them Mithlond, and there they held many ships, for the harbourage was good. From the grey havens the Eldar ever and anon set sail, fleeing from the darkness of the days of earth, for by the mercy of the Vala the firstborn could still follow the straight road and return, if they would, to their kindred in Eresia and Valanor beyond the encircling seas. Others of the Eldar there were who crossed the mountains of Eredluin in that age and passed into the inner lands. Many of these were Tillery, survivors of Doriath and Osiriand, and they established realms among the Sylvan elves in woods and mountains far from the sea, for which nonetheless they ever yearned in their hearts. Only in Eregion, which men called Hollin, did elves of Noldorin race establish a lasting realm beyond the Irid Luin. Eregion was nigh to the great mansions of the dwarves that were named Khazad-dûm, but by the elves Hadodrond and afterwards Moria. From Ost in Eadhil, the city of the elves, the high road ran to the west gate of Khazad-dûm, for a friendship arose between dwarves and elves such as has never elsewhere been, to the enrichment of both those peoples. In Eregion, the craftsmen of the Gwaith y Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths, surpassed in cunning all that hath ever wrought, save only Fëanor himself, and indeed greatest in skill among them was Celebrimbor, son of Curufin, who was estranged from his father and remained in Nargothrond when Celegorm and Curufin were driven forth, as is told in the Quenta Silmarillion. Elsewhere in Middle-earth there was peace for many years, yet the lands were for the most part savage and desolate, save only where the people of Beleriand came. Many elves dwelt there indeed, as they had dwelt through the countless years, wandering free in the wide lands far from the sea, but they were Avari, to whom the deeds of Beleriand were but a rumour, and Valanor only a distant name. And in the south and in the further east men multiplied, and most of them turned to evil, for Sauron was at work. Seeing the desolation of the world, Sauron said in his heart that the Vala, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Númenor, who came back at whiles in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled his mind and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. Man he found the easiest to sway of all the peoples of the earth, but long he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew that the firstborn had the greater power, and he went far and wide among them, and his hue was still that of one both fair and wise. Only to Lindon did he not come, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him and his fair seeming, and though they knew not who in truth he was, they would not admit him to that land. But elsewhere the elves received him gladly, and few among them hearkened to the messengers from Lindon, bidding them beware. For Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and they had at first much profit from his friendship. And he said to them,
Alas for the weakness of the great, for a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labors. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eresia, nay even as Valinor. And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth, as do I. Is it not then our task to labor together for its enrichment and for the raising of all the elven kindreds that wander here untaught to the height of that power and knowledge which those have who are beyond the sea?
It was in Eregion that the counsels of Sauron were most gladly received, for in that land the Noldor desired ever to increase the skill and subtlety of their works. Moreover, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return into the West, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, which indeed they loved, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed. Therefore they hearkened to Sauron, and they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. In those days the smiths of Ost in Eadhil surpassed all that they had contrived before, and they took thought, and they made rings of power. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and to bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others, and their power was bound up with it to be subject wholly to it, and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency. And Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow. And while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. But the elves were not so lightly to be caught. As soon as Sauron set the one ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him and perceived that he would be master of them, and of all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings. But he, finding that he was betrayed, and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away, and hid them. Now these were the 3 that last had been made, and they possessed the greatest powers. Nadia, Nenya, and Velia they were named, the rings of fire, and of water, and of air, set with ruby, and adamant, and sapphire. And of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them, for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world. But Sauron could not discover them, for they were given into the hands of the wise, who concealed them and never again used them openly, while Sauron kept the ruling ring. Therefore the three remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them, yet they also were subject to the One. From that time, war never ceased between Sauron and the elves, and Eregion was laid waste, and Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. In that time, the stronghold and refuge of Imladris, that man called Rivendell, was founded by Elrond, half-elven, and long it endured. But Sauron gathered into his hands all the remaining rings of power, and he dealt them out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarfs, but to men he gave 9, for men proved in this matter, as in others, the readiest to his will. And all those rings that he governed he perverted, the more easily, since he had a part in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed in the end all those that used them. The dwarfs indeed proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They use their rings only for the getting of wealth, but wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the profit of Sauron. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hordes long ago were plundered, and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings some were consumed in fire, and some Sauron recovered. Man proved easier to ensnare. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk, if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal man. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the one which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. The Nazgul were they, the ringwraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants. Darkness went with them, and they cried with the voices of death. Now Sauron's lust and pride increased until he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things in Middle-earth, and to destroy the elves, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Númenor. He brooked no freedom nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. A mask he still could wear, so that if he wished, he might deceive the eyes of men, seeming to them wise and fair. But he ruled rather by force and fear, if they might avail, and those who perceived his shadow spreading over the world called him the Dark Lord, and named him the Enemy. And he gathered again under his government all the evil things of the days of Morgoth that remained on earth or beneath it, and the orcs were at his command and multiplied like flies. Thus the black years began, which the elves call the days of flight. In that time many of the elves of Middle-earth fled to Lindon, and thence over the seas, never to return, and many were destroyed by Sauron and his servants. But in Lindon Gil-galad still maintained his power, and Sauron dared not as yet to pass the mountains of Eregion, nor to assail the havens, and Gil-galad was aided by the Númenoreans. Elsewhere Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain, and ever fear pursued them. In the east and south, well nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in those days, and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war, and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Yet there came at length a stay in the onslaught of Sauron upon the Westlands, for as is told in the Yakalabeth, he was challenged by the might of Númenor. So great was the power and splendor of the Númenoreans in the noontide of their realm, that the servants of Sauron would not withstand them, and hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, he left Middle-earth for a while, and went to Númenor as a hostage of Tarkalion, the king. And there he abode until at the last by his craft he had corrupted the hearts of most of that people, and set them at war with the Vala, and so compassed their ruin as he had long desired. But that ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. The world was broken, and the land was swallowed up, and the seas rose over it, and Sauron himself went down into the abyss. But his spirit arose and fled back on a dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. There he found that the power of Gil-galad had grown great in the years of his absence, and it was spread now over wide regions of the north and west, and had passed beyond the misty mountains and the great river, even to the borders of Greenwood the Great, and was drawing nigh to the strong places where once he had dwelt secure. Then Sauron withdrew to his fortress in the Black Land and meditated war. In that time, those of the Númenoreans who were saved from destruction fled eastward, as is told in the Yakhalabeth. The chief of these were Elendil the Tall and his sons, Isildur and Anárion. Kinsmen of the king they were, descendants of Elros, but they had been unwilling to listen to Sauron and had refused to make war on the lords of the west. Manning their ships with all who remained faithful, they forsook the land of Númenor ere ruin came upon it. They were mighty men, and their ships were strong and tall, but the tempests overtook them, and they were borne aloft on hills of water, even to the clouds, and they descended upon Middle-earth like birds of the storm. Elendil was cast up by the waves in the land of Lindon, and he was befriended by Gil-galad. Thence he passed up the river Lune, and beyond Eregion he established his realm, and his people dwelt in many places in Eriador, about the courses of the Lune and the Baranduin, but his chief city was at Anúminas, beside the water of Lake Ninuyal. At Fornost upon the north downs also the Númenoreans dwelt, and in Cardolan, and in the hills of Rúdaur. And towers they raised upon Emin-bereid and upon Amon-Sul. And there remain many barrows and ruined works in those places, but the towers of Emin-bereid still look towards the sea. Isildur and Anárion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships up the great river Anduin that flows out of Rovanion into the western sea in the Bay of Belfalas, and they established a realm in those lands that were after called Gondor, whereas the northern kingdom was named Anor. Long before, in the days of their power, the mariners of Númenor had established a haven and strong places about the mouths of Anduin, in despite of Sauron in the Black Land that lay nigh upon the east. In the later days to this haven came only the faithful of Númenor, and many therefore of the folk of the coastlands in that region were in whole or in part akin to the elf friends and the people of Elendil, and they welcomed his sons. The chief city of this southern realm was Osgiliath, through the midst of which the great river flowed, and the Númenoreans built there a great bridge, upon which there were towers and houses of stone, wonderful to behold, and tall ships came up out of the sea to the quays of the city. Other strong places they built also upon either hand: Minas Ithil, the tower of the rising moon, eastward upon the shoulder of the mountains of shadow as a threat to Mordor, and to the westward Minas Anor, the tower of the setting sun, at the feet of Mount Mondoluin, as a shield against the wild men of the dales. In Minas Ithil was the house of Isildur, and in Minas Anor the house of Anárion, but they shared the realm between them, and their thrones were set side by side in the great hall of Osgiliath. These were the chief dwellings of the Númenoreans in Gondor, but other works, marvelous and strong, they built in that land in the days of their power, at the Argonath, and at Aglarond, and at Erech, and in the circle of Agrenost, which men called Isengard, they made the pinnacle of Orthanc, of unbreakable stone. Many treasures and great heirlooms of virtue and wonder the exiles had brought from Númenor, and of these the most renowned were the 7 stones and the white tree. The white tree was grown from the fruit of Nimloth the fair, that stood in the courts of the king at Armenelos in Númenor, ere Sauron burnt it. And Nimloth was in its turn descended from the tree of Tirion, that was an image of the eldest of trees, white Tilperion, which Yavanna caused to grow in the land of the Vala. The tree, memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valanor, was planted in Minas Ithil before the house of Isildur, since he it was that had saved the fruit from destruction, but the stones were divided. 3 Elendil took, and his sons each 2. Those of Elendil were set in towers upon Emin Bereid and upon Amon Sul, and in the city of Anúminas. But those of his sons were at Minas Ithil and Minas Anor, and at Orthanc, and in Osgiliath. Now these stones had this virtue, that those who looked therein might perceive in them things far off, whether in place or in time. For the most part they revealed only things near to another kindred stone, for the stones each called to each. But those who possessed great strength of will and of mind might learn to direct their gaze whither they would. Thus the Númenorians were aware of many things that their enemies wished to conceal, and little escaped their vigilance in the days of their might. It is said that the towers of Emin Bereid were not built indeed by the exiles of Númenor, but were raised by Gil-galad for Elendil, his friend, and the seeing stone of Emin Bereid was set in Elostirion, the tallest of the tower. Thither Elendil would repair, and thence he would gaze out over the sundering seas, when the yearning of exile was upon him, and it is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away even the tower of Avalone upon Eresia, where the Master Stone abode and yet abides. These stones were gifts of the Eldar to Amandil, father of Elendil, for the comfort of the faithful of Numenor in their dark days, when the elves might come no longer to that land under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar, but all those that were brought to Middle-earth long ago were lost.